My name is Philip Kleinfeld. I am a freelance journalist based in Central Africa. I've been covering conflicts and humanitarian crises in the region for the past 3 years. And I just returned recently from a 5-week trip to the Central African Republic, where I was reporting for IRIN on the peacekeeping mission, on the conflict, and on the humanitarian crisis. I think when you work on neglected stories, there is a sense of urgency and purpose that you don't experience in quite the same way working on other stories in different parts of the world. You know that the people you are meeting, it may be their only chance to speak to a journalist. They may have not spoken to a journalist in a long time. They may not have spoken to a journalist ever. And I think, particularly when you're working in challenging environments and risky places, knowing that this might be the one opportunity for a reporter to do this story gives you a real impetus to keep on going and to get that story told. I think also as a profession, we don't tend to use our resources very effectively. You might have 100 journalists from all over the world sitting in the White House, listening to the same person, giving the same bad answers to the same questions. And yet in a place like the Central African Republic or South Sudan, you might not have a single English language journalist in one of the world's most urgent humanitarian crises and one of the worst conflicts. And I think that's not a good way of using our resources, and I know personally where I would rather be. So I don't think you can claim that in a country that has more than 10,000 peacekeepers and pretty much every NGO worth its salt working there in the capital, at least Bangui, that it's a neglected crisis, but certainly in terms of the media attention received, it's almost non-existent. And so as a reporter, that certainly gives me an appetite to travel there and to report from that region. I think also the story that gets told about the Central African Republic is not very good. And I think journalists bear quite a lot of responsibility for that. And also we bear some responsibility for trying to tell the correct story about the Central African Republic. The story that usually gets told is that this is somehow a sort of religious conflict between Christians on the one hand and Muslims on the other. And while there's certainly a component of that in the story, there is a sort of religious and ethnic divide. It's much more complex than that. The kinds of people that are involved in this conflict, the rebels themselves, they've been a feature of the security landscape in the Central African Republic for many, many years. It's a complex story. And I think, again, that's something that really attracts me to going to a place like the Central African Republic to try and understand what's motivating these people to fight and ultimately what's causing all these issues for civilians. So Kara is obviously a very dangerous place, primarily for civilians, but also for the international community, for peacekeepers, for humanitarians, and indeed for journalists. One of whom was killed, Camille Lepage, a few years ago, and that case remains ongoing, the case into how she was killed. Over the last year to 18 months, there has been a real uptick in violence in the Central African Republic, largely by these ex-Seleka groups who were once united and have since been fighting one another. That's caused record levels of displacement for civilians. It's also caused a huge number of security incidents for humanitarians, and there have been a series of attacks on peacekeepers too, which is one of the things I explore in the first part of this 3-part series that we've been working on. One of the main conflict dynamics over the last 12 to 18 months has been what analysts call splintering warfare. The rebel groups where there was once these kind of clean battle lines of Seleka versus anti-Balaka, there are now a plethora of armed groups which keep on splitting and dividing. As a journalist, as a humanitarian also I imagine, but as a journalist, keeping track of how these armed groups are composed and structured is really critical for your own sort of well-being and safety in the field, but it can be something that's quite kind of challenging to follow. So the situation I encountered in Bangassou, which is one of the main places I write about in the first part of the series on the peacekeeping mission, was nothing short of remarkable. There was an attack last May 13th, on the town's Muslim community, and ever since they've been living in a displacement site in the grounds of a Catholic church. I was interviewing a woman, a young woman, and her very sick child who was 14 months old at the periphery of the Catholic seminary, at the periphery of the camp, and a round of gunfire fizzed right past us. My immediate reaction was to kind of throw myself to the floor and get out of there as quickly as possible. But you know what? A few people scattered. Most people just carried on as if nothing had happened. And I turned to this lady who was standing right next to me, and I asked her, what is it like living under daily intimidation from these militia? What is it like, you know, living to the cadence of gunfire? And she said, it is like singing the national anthem. It happens every day. I think there are a few things I would like people to take away from the series that we've just done. Mainly the Central African Republic is important. It matters. The lives of the people that live there matter. That it's complicated, that the conflict drivers are multiple. There are multiple conflict drivers. And that it deserves the kinds of in-depth reporting that we're trying to do. The conflict that we documented last year had multiple overlapping factors. The UN mission that struggled to keep the peace, particularly the staff that work for the UN, they deserve criticism, but they also deserve applause. What they do is not easy. And also I think that peacekeeping is not just about protecting civilians. It is essentially a gigantic experiment, at least in the Central African Republic, in trying to build or rehabilitate a state. And I think that needs critical attention from journalists.